Welcome to my talk, Learning from, Talking about, and Reflecting on Data Loss, a Failure Report. Griscom and Harvey 2020 is a large, diverse archival record of language and cultural material from the Hadza people of Tanzania, collected between 2019 and 2021 and employing a community-based model. While this collection represents a considerable contribution to Hadza language work, in the sense of Leonard 2021, it's not perfect. During the course of collecting and processing the audiovisual materials, a considerable amount of video material associated with the collection was lost. This loss of data will be the focus of the talk. Language documentation projects are complex undertakings, and failures, including data loss, are frequent. At the same time, it is not always easy for language documentarians to talk about their failures. This ultimately makes it easier for specific failures to occur again at different times and in different projects. Modeling this talk on a failure report, the specific failure is examined in detail, the causes of the failure made explicit, and the lessons learned enumerated. The project, which resulted in Griscom and Harvey 2020, is, in many ways, a great success, both in terms of data collected as well as the relationships developed throughout. With that said, focusing on the data loss which occurred is useful in several ways. It helps make what happened explicit such that learning can occur. It creates a space to talk about the dynamics of community-based work with marginalized communities, and it allows us to be reflexive in our praxis. As a quick initial note on the data, this talk will be made openly accessible online shortly after its live presentation, both archived with Zenodo with the DOI on screen, as well as watchable directly on YouTube via the channel link QR code on screen. And I'll make a use of a handful of QR codes throughout this talk, so if you're interested, please feel free to scan and follow. I'd like now to briefly introduce the language whose documentation the current talk will address. That is, Hadza. Geographically speaking, Hadza is spoken primarily in the area around Lake Eyasi in the East African country of Tanzania. Some of the communities visited during the documentation project are highlighted with blue circles here. Genetically, Hadza was originally classified as a member of the so-called Khoisan phylum of languages, linking it with other languages which employ phonemic click consonants spoken far away in the southwest of the African continent. Today, it is widely recognized that Khoisan is not a coherent genetic grouping and that Hadza cannot be convincingly linked to any so-called Khoisan language or any other language. It is therefore best described as a language isolate. From this map, itself a classic work on the Tanzanian Rift Valley, we can see that Hadza exists in a rich regional language ecology with languages from many different language phyla spoken alongside or nearby the Hadza-speaking area, here highlighted in red. Regarding language use and attitudes towards the language, I'd like to say that this is a complex and important topic and deserves considerably more attention and nuance than I've provided on this slide. For those of us who are interested in a bit more detail, I'd encourage you to read a report of a workshop held in 2018 in which some Hadza speakers, among speakers of other languages, shared thoughts about their language, the changes it is undergoing, and prospects for the future. This can be accessed by scanning the QR code currently on screen. A first detail that we might notice is that there is huge variation in estimates for the number of people who speak Hadza. Work by anthropologist Nicholas Blurton-Jones provides a figure of 1,000, and work by the Languages of Tanzania project gives more than 6,000. My colleague Richard Griscom and I, based on our documentary work, have a feeling that the figure is probably something closer to around 2,000. In virtually all cases, Hadza people of all ages, including the youngest children, continue to use Hadza, but it is important to recognize that though the Hadza people continue to use and transmit their language, the speaker community as a small population which lacks access to healthcare, education, political representation, and many of whom rely on the resources of a fragile forest ecosystem, the threats facing the Hadzabe people are significant and existential. Most Hadza speakers recognize that the way that they speak is markedly different from other languages of Tanzania, and my impression is that there is a considerable amount of pride in its use, both as a medium through which Hadza culture and everyday life is transmitted, and also as a code maintaining and establishing this sparsely populated community across a relatively large geographical area. At the same time, it is not uncommon to encounter Tanzanians from other ethnic groups who believe that Hadza is simply not a language. I'd like now to play a brief clip of the Hadza language so that we can both get a sense for how the language sounds and how it looks. This particular recording was made as part of the Hadza documentation project and is part of a conversation between the local researcher Bunga Paulo here on the left and Ate Pandisha on the right. Here they talk about taboos, particularly associated with hunting. For a bit further context about me, my work in language documentation began in 2012 during my master's studies at the University of Dar es Salaam, where I began making recordings of another Tanzanian language, Gorwa, as part of my dissertation. This continued on and off through my doctoral studies at SOAS, during which I continued working with Gorwa, essentially making most of the decisions regarding the documentation on my own in a classic outsider-led documentation format. Things changed around 2017 when myself and my Gorwa colleagues decided to try something new. Instead of me going around with the camera and the recording device, we decided that, actually, training Gorwa speakers themselves to conduct this work would not only be more efficient, but it would also result in a richer documentation. So from this point, essentially to present, the Gorwa language documentation project continues, with Gorwa speakers themselves not only producing the recordings, but deciding who to interview, what to talk about, and how to go about exploring their histories, languages, and cultures. This insider-led approach was really a turning point in my documentary praxis, and basically all documentations I've been part of have been insider-led projects. In 2019, I began a similar insider-led project documenting Ihanzu, spoken in the same region of Tanzania, which we often call the Tanzanian Rift Valley. And in the same year, my colleague Richard Griscom and I began an ELDP-funded project documenting the Hadza language, spoken nearby to where Gorwa and Ihanzu are spoken in central Tanzania. Returning now to the object of today's inquiry, that is, the collection of Hadza materials, we can see that it is currently composed of 226 hours of audiovisual recordings. That is, the collection represents 226 unique hours of songs, stories, procedural explanations, and other language and cultural material in the Hadza language. Though it is certainly not the only way we can measure the Hadza collection with others, it is one surface-level way to look at it. And when using this metric of size, we can see that yes, the Hadza collection is relatively large. The only larger collections I know of personally being represented by the Ihanzu and Gorwa deposits, again, documentary projects with which I am also involved. As I said, however, size is really only one shallow metric we can use to look at a documentary collection. In addition to being relatively large, the Hadza collection is notable in that the vast majority of data collection was carried out by Hadza-speaking people themselves, who were trained in documentary field methods at the beginning of the project and who were given a large amount of freedom to choose how they went about their work, who they worked with, and what they recorded. This is an image taken during the training of these local researchers at the beginning of the ELDP-funded project in late 2019. For those of you interested in learning more about this training session, I encourage you to follow the QR link to a report written by Richard and I about how it happened. In terms of discussion on failure in documentary linguistics, the literature is largely silent. On the specific topic of data loss, I've encountered no concrete case studies in the literature of anyone going into any detail about this. Though we know that data loss does happen, This photo from the fire which destroyed Brazil's National Museum in 2018 being one example on a disastrous scale. Probably much more common, however, is data loss on a smaller, more individual, more mundane scale, the kind of stuff you hear about while sitting next to colleagues at conference dinners or perhaps on the margins of office meetings, things that normally don't make their way into the written record. Happily, Martha Tsotsui-Billins has provided a great service with her Field Notes podcast, making this kind of marginal talk accessible to anyone. From a quick scan of the interviews she's conducted, we have several examples of this individual level data loss, including these 3 cases listed here. The first 2 accounts of data loss were actually results of data being stolen along with other valuables. This kind of data loss through largely external forces, won't be the focus of my discussion today. Instead, I'd like to focus on the kind of data loss similar to that described by Khairun Issa, that is, data loss which was largely preventable and which was largely a product of data organization, data flow, and the operation of the technological machinery of a workflow. In the case of the Hadza project, this is most commonly manifest as videos which unexpectedly cut, a selection of which can be seen on screen. Returning to a global view of the collection, it allows us to talk about the scale of this loss. Of the 226 hours of Hadza recordings, approximately 184 hours of data includes video. Of these 184 hours of expected video, approximately 18 hours is missing, so a figure of approximately 10% of the total quantity of video recordings. This loss goes beyond its appearance on a pie chart. Each lost video represents lost effort on the part of our local researchers. Even worse, some lost videos represent the only recordings featuring a certain individual or featuring a certain story, song, or personal narrative. Given that we were trusted by the Hadza people to protect this material, this is an acute failure to honor that trust. So, how did this happen? Well, as most of us in the room will know from direct experience, language documentation is a complex undertaking composed of multiple steps and many discrete flows through which data will move. In the context of the Hadza project, some of these data flows were undertaken by linguists, Richard and myself, but the vast majority were done by the local Hadza researchers. I'd specifically like to focus on 2 related steps where our specific problem occurred. The first being the transfer of recorded materials from video cameras to the hard drives. In the form of a basic schematic, this is what it would look like, moving recorded video to the hard drives with which local researchers would back up their work. This was mediated by small laptop computers. Crucially, these machines ran Linux, which in this case did not feature a progress bar when the data was being moved, but rather a much more subtle circle, located rather unobtrusively in the upper right of the screen. Because of this less explicit feature, people were plugging in their cameras, beginning the upload process, but then, tragically, not seeing the upload circle and unplugging the cameras before the upload was complete. This data loss was then rendered permanent when memory cards became full. Local researchers would delete the contents of the memory cards to make room for new video, and the video recordings would be irretrievably lost. The problem was rendered somewhat insidious in that often these incomplete uploads were, on the surface, difficult to detect in checks. One can open these incomplete files, and very often they will play for a certain time before cutting. They even display their original full time in the lower control bar. As such, the issue would only come up if one clicked to the end of the recording, and the problem was thus detected quite late in the project. In this case, some specific fixes here would be at each of the points of failure. For example, though local researchers had been trained on the upload process, an additional failsafe would have been to use larger memory cards, thus reducing the need to regularly wipe the video recordings from the cameras. The destructive step of finally wiping the video recordings might also be redelegated to the linguists, who would have then been able to conduct a more thorough check of the material before final deletion. On another level, the solution lies in greater support. The Hadza collection is very much a product of its time, very specifically the time of a global pandemic, in which almost immediately following the project's start, both Richard and I experienced considerable difficulty returning to Tanzania and overseeing the project in person. Even when I had returned to Tanzania, because the Hadza-speaking community is located across a vast area of central Tanzania, traveling to see local researchers as often as they probably needed was very difficult. To conclude then, I'd reiterate that the Hadza collection is by many measures a success in terms of the volume of materials collected, the level of community agency, as well as the kinds of material collected. But with that said, and as is the case with all documentary endeavors, it was not perfect. This talk focused on these issues and discussed some of the root causes and ways to avoid these specific issues in the future. More broadly, the title of this conference is Where Do We Go From Here? In a metaphorical and maybe vague sense, the answer is obviously forward based on our successes, and there are many. But I would hope that in moving forward, we also look backward, perhaps especially at those aspects of our work that are embarrassing, uncomfortable, or even painful. In doing this in an analytical way, that is, in being critically reflexive, I believe that our work can become continually better, and the chance of specific failures being repeated becomes less and less likely. And before I finish, I would like to thank my colleague and friend Richard Griscom for his partnership during the Hadza documentation project, as well as for his thoughts and interventions when I first began thinking about these things. Sam Beer helped me look into silences surrounding data loss stories in documentary linguistics. And finally, I would like to thank Hadza local researchers Bunga Paolo, Mariamu Anyawire, Endeko Simon, Nange Chaka, Angela Sampson, Jacobo Lubumba, and Elizabeth Minja, as well as all of the Hadza people who have contributed their time, knowledge, and culture to the documentation project. Thank you, and here are my references.